The desert sun blazed mercilessly above the training grounds, baking the sand into a shimmering canvas of heat. Rows of bleachers had been assembled on the outskirts of the Navy facility, filled with civilians, journalists, and dignitaries who had been invited to witness what was promised to be a rare public demonstration. This wasn't just any shooting competition. It was a showcase of America's most elite warriors, the Navy SEAL snipers, proving their accuracy and discipline before an eager crowd. At the far end of their range, 100 steel targets stood at varying distances. Some were close enough to see clearly with the naked eye, while others were so far they looked like mere dots against the desert horizon. A few targets had been set on swivels, designed to move unpredictably when the wind picked up. The organizers had boasted beforehand, "You'll see why these men are the best in the world." The crowd buzzed with anticipation. Families with children sat alongside stern-faced veterans, their hands folded respectfully on their knees. Reporters checked their cameras and prepared their notepads, already composing headlines in their heads. This was more than entertainment. It was a rare chance to peek into the secretive world of special operations. Then came the announcement over the loudspeakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our Navy SEAL sniper team." The bleachers erupted in cheers as a group of men in camouflage uniforms stepped forward, rifles slung across their shoulders with casual ease. They walked with the steady confidence of soldiers who had faced danger far greater than a row of steel targets. To the untrained eye, they looked like ordinary men, lean, strong, disciplined. But everyone present knew that each of them had endured training that broke weaker men, missions that had tested the limits of human endurance, and firefights where a single mistake meant death. As they took their places at the firing line, an officer stepped forward to address the audience. "Today, you will witness precision at its finest," he said. 100 targets. Each marksman will take his turn. The Navy SEALs are known around the world for their unmatched accuracy. You are in for a treat. Applause broke out again. The atmosphere felt electric, like the opening act of a grand performance. The first sniper stepped up. He lowered himself into position, adjusted his scope, and steadied his breathing. The crowd quieted, holding their breath in anticipation of perfection. The sharp crack of the rifle echoed across the desert, and the first target fell. Cheers erupted instantly, but the second shot missed. At first, no one reacted. A single miss was nothing unusual. Perhaps the wind shifted. Perhaps the scope needed a slight adjustment. The sniper fired again, hitting the third target cleanly. The fourth, however, stood untouched. A murmur passed through the stands. By the 10th shot, only 6 targets had fallen. The sniper's jaw tightened, his frustration visible, even from a distance. He shook his head slightly, repositioned himself, and continued firing. Some bullets connected with satisfying clangs, but far too many whizzed past harmlessly. When his run ended, less than 2/3 of the targets had been hit. Polite applause followed, but it was noticeably less enthusiastic than before. The second sniper stepped forward, determination etched into his face. Perhaps he would redeem the team. He lined up his first shot, exhaled, and fired. Another clean hit. The audience cheered again. But then came another miss. And another. His performance mirrored the first sniper's. Good, but far from perfect. By the time he finished, the disappointment in the crowd was palpable. Parents who had brought their children to watch whispered uncomfortably. Veterans shifted in their seats, unwilling to criticize but clearly surprised. The journalists scribbled furiously, their stories taking a different shape than expected. The third sniper stepped up, then the fourth. Each one carried the same reputation, the same aura of invincibility, but the results kept slipping. Some did better, some worse, but none came close to hitting all the targets. By the time the 5th sniper finished, the 100 targets had begun to look less like opponents and more like taunting reminders of human imperfection. The officer in charge tried to maintain enthusiasm. "Ladies and gentlemen, these conditions are tougher than they look," he announced. "Remember, these targets are positioned at distances most of us can't even comprehend." But the crowd knew something was off. The myth of flawless precision was cracking. These were supposed to be the best of the best, yet they were missing over and over again. A young boy in the front row tugged on his father's sleeve and asked, "Dad, why are they missing so much?" The father, a former Marine, simply shook his head, unsure how to answer. For the SEALs, the humiliation was worse than the heat of the desert sun. They weren't used to failure, not in front of an audience. They exchanged glances, their pride stung, their reputation hanging precariously in the balance. The final sniper took his turn, and though he started strong, fatigue and pressure wore him down. By the end, his score wasn't much better than the rest. When the demonstration concluded, the tally was clear. Out of 100 targets, not a single sniper had managed to come close to a perfect run. Some had barely cleared half. The audience applauded politely, but the energy had drained away. Instead of awe and admiration, there was confusion. Whispers filled the air. "I thought they were the best? Maybe the targets are rigged. No, they're just missing." "Look at that." The officer stepped up again, forcing a smile. "Thank you for your support. Remember, these men are trained for combat conditions far more complex than target practice. What you saw today was only a small glimpse of their skill, but the words rang hollow. The crowd wasn't convinced. The mystique had faded. And then, just when the atmosphere felt like it might collapse into disappointment, one voice rose above the chatter. "Let me try." The words were quiet, almost hesitant, but in the tense silence that hung over the training grounds, they carried farther than expected. Heads turned, eyebrows raised, and eyes searched the bleachers to see who had spoken. It wasn't one of the soldiers. It wasn't one of the officers. It wasn't anyone in uniform at all. It was a woman, ordinary, unassuming, seated in the middle row of the bleachers, standing now with her chin lifted ever so slightly. She wore jeans, a simple shirt, and a look of calm confidence. The crowd laughed nervously. Surely she was joking. But the way she said it, quiet, steady, without a hint of humor, left everyone momentarily stunned. And with that, the story took its first unexpected turn. The murmur of laughter rippled through the bleachers at first light, dismissive, the kind of laugh that said, "She can't be serious." But the woman didn't flinch. She stood calmly, her hands relaxed at her sides, her gaze steady on the officer near the firing line. Her voice, though soft, had carried across the training ground with the clarity of conviction. "Let me try." The officer blinked in disbelief. He had spent years overseeing demonstrations like this, and never once had a civilian dared to ask something so outrageous. For a moment, he wondered if she was mocking them, poking fun at the sniper's failure. His jaw tightened. From the crowd came a mix of reactions. "Sit down, lady," someone shouted. "She's kidding, right?" Another laughed. "No way they'll let her touch that rifle." But not everyone was laughing. A few spectators watched her closely, noting the unusual calm in her expression. She didn't look like a heckler trying to grab attention. She didn't look nervous either. She simply looked ready. The officer tried to brush it off. "Ma'am, this is a controlled demonstration," he said firmly, his voice echoing over the microphone. "The equipment is restricted to trained military personnel. Please enjoy the show from your seat." She didn't sit down. Instead, she stepped closer to the railing at the front of the bleachers. Her eyes never wavered from him. "You said 100 targets," she replied, loud enough for the audience to hear. "No one's hit them yet." "Let me try." The simplicity of her words struck a nerve. The crowd hushed, sensing a strange shift in the atmosphere. The SEALs, who had retreated behind the firing line after their turns, exchanged curious glances. Some smirked, some frowned, but all of them turned their attention to her. The officer exhaled slowly. "Ma'am," he began again, but she interrupted him. "What's the harm?" she asked. "You've missed more than half. Maybe I'll do the same. Maybe I'll do worse. But you won't know unless you let me try." That word try hung in the air like a challenge. The audience stirred. A young man in the back shouted, "Let her do it." Laughter followed, then applause. Soon, more voices joined in, cheering her on. "Let her try. Let her try." The officer looked uneasy. This wasn't how demonstrations were supposed to go. The Navy SEAL program prided itself on control, discipline, and spectacle, but this was chaos. Allowing a civilian to fire a sniper rifle in front of hundreds of people was not just unusual, it was nearly unthinkable. And yet, the momentum was building. Every time he opened his mouth to shut her down, the chants grew louder. Let her try. The woman didn't smile, didn't bask in the sudden attention. She only stood there, her presence as steady as her voice. One of the SEALs stepped forward, lowering his rifle. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar running down his jawline, clearly a veteran. "Sir," he said quietly to the officer, though the microphones picked up fragments of his words. "What's the risk? The targets are already set. The rifles are loaded. One run won't change anything." The officer glared at him. "This isn't protocol. Neither is missing half the targets," the SEAL replied bluntly. His eyes flicked toward the woman, narrowing as though he were studying her. Something about her confidence unsettled him. She wasn't bluffing. He could sense it. After a long pause, the officer raised the microphone again. His voice was tight, reluctant. "Ma'am," he said, "if you're serious, step forward." A hush fell over the crowd. The laughter died instantly. The woman didn't hesitate. She moved gracefully down the bleacher steps, her movements unhurried, almost deliberate, as though she were walking into a place she already belonged. The crowd watched in silence, every pair of eyes fixed on her. Even the desert wind seemed to pause. When she reached the firing line, the officer studied her closely. She looked ordinary, no military insignia, no special gear, nothing to suggest training. She wasn't imposing. In fact, she looked like someone you might pass on the street without a second glance. And yet, there was something undeniable in her demeanor. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sarah," she said simply. "Sarah what?" "Just Sarah." Her answer annoyed him, but he didn't push it further. He gestured toward the sniper rifle resting on its stand. "This is not a game. These weapons are powerful and dangerous if handled carelessly. Do you have any training?" She met his gaze without blinking. "Enough." The SEAL with the scar raised an eyebrow at her response. "Enough? What kind of answer was that?" The officer hesitated. Protocol screamed at him to end this madness, to escort her back to the bleachers, to restore order. But the eyes of the crowd burned into him, demanding he follow through. If he denied her now, the humiliation of the earlier misses would sting even deeper. Perhaps, he reasoned, letting her fail would quiet the critics. "Fine," he said at last, his tone clipped. "One attempt. If you mishandle the weapon, you stop immediately. Understood?" Sarah nodded. "Understood." The SEAL stepped forward again, this time handing her his rifle. The weapon looked heavy, but she accepted it with surprising ease, her grip firm and practiced. The SEAL narrowed his eyes further. He knew instantly. This was not her first time holding a rifle. The audience gasped as she adjusted the strap, settling the weapon into position with the fluidity of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. She lowered herself to the ground in a smooth motion, her elbows pressing into the dirt, her cheek resting against the stock. The move was natural, unforced. "She's done this before," someone whispered in the crowd. The officer said nothing. He only watched, torn between apprehension and curiosity. Sarah took a long breath, letting the exhale whistle faintly between her lips. Her finger hovered near the trigger, but she didn't rush. Her eye settled on the scope, and in that instant, it was as if the world narrowed to the barrel of the rifle and the distant line of targets. The noise of the crowd faded. The blazing sun became irrelevant. Her heartbeat slowed, each thud deliberate, controlled. To everyone else, it looked like hesitation. But to Sarah, it was alignment, breath, body, rifle, target. Then, in a voice so quiet only the SEAL beside her could hear, she whispered, "Let's begin." And with that, she steadied her aim at the first target, her finger brushing the trigger, and the range fell silent once again. Sarah lay prone on the hot desert ground, the rifle pressed firmly into her shoulder, the stock warm against her cheek. Grains of sand clung to her elbows, but she didn't seem to notice. Her breathing slowed, each inhale measured, each exhale deliberate. To the hundreds of onlookers, it appeared as if she had entered another world, a place far removed from the chatter, the skepticism, and the weight of expectation that now hung over her. The crowd, moments earlier buzzing with disbelief, fell into silence. Children leaned forward in their seats. Parents watched with narrowed eyes. Veterans in the stands recognized the ritual, the stillness before the shot, the way the body synchronized with the weapon. Some of them frowned, whispering, "She knows what she's doing." Behind her, the SEAL with the scarred jaw whose rifle she now held watched intently. His arms were folded, but his sharp eyes studied every movement. He had seen countless rookies crumble under the pressure of simply holding a sniper rifle, their hands trembling, their breathing erratic. Sarah was different. Her movements were neither hesitant nor theatrical. They were efficient, purposeful, like a professional who had repeated the same motions thousands of times. The officer in charge shifted uneasily. He wanted to stop this. Every instinct told him it was a mistake. But the eyes of the crowd, the memory of the SEAL's poor performance, and Sarah's calm defiance kept him silent. He tapped his earpiece, muttering to another officer nearby, "Keep the safety crew ready." "I don't trust this." Sarah adjusted the scope with delicate precision, her fingers moving over the knobs, as though she knew exactly how to align them. She blinked once, letting her vision settle into the circle of glass. Through the scope, the world transformed. The 100 targets no longer looked like distant specks of metal. They became clear, defined, each one a challenge awaiting its turn. She adjusted her body slightly, angling her torso until it aligned perfectly with the rifle. Her legs stretched out behind her, boots digging into the dirt. A small puff of sand rose as she exhaled again, slow and steady. From the bleachers, someone whispered, "Why is she taking so long?" Another replied, "Because she actually knows what she's doing." The officer's jaw tightened at that comment, but he stayed silent. Sarah's focus deepened. She wasn't here to show off. She wasn't here for the cheers. She was here because she had said 3 words, "Let me try," and she had meant them. Memories flickered at the edges of her mind-long nights at the range, the steady crack of rifles, the silence after each bullet struck its target. She remembered the discipline of stillness, the art of breathing, the lesson drilled into her long ago. The rifle is not a weapon. It's an extension of yourself. She pressed her cheek tighter to the stock. The rifle no longer felt borrowed. It felt familiar, as if it had been waiting for her all along. The SEAL with the scar leaned slightly closer, muttering under his breath, "She's got form." The officer glanced at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean," the SEAL replied quietly, "she's no amateur. Watch her shoulders, her breathing. That's training. The officer's frown deepened. But where? She's not one of ours. The SEAL didn't answer. He didn't need to. He knew that kind of composure wasn't learned in a day. Whoever Sarah was, she had spent years preparing for moments like this. The crowd grew restless, but it wasn't the restless impatience of boredom. It was the tense anticipation before a storm. Every second she remained still added weight to the air. A child's voice broke the silence. "Mom, is she scared?" The mother shook her head slowly. "No, she's focused." Sarah's finger hovered near the trigger now, not quite touching it. Her eyes narrowed behind the scope. In her vision, the first target stood clear and sharp, the desert wind brushing lightly against it. She adjusted for the breeze instinctively, shifting the angle of the rifle by a fraction of an inch. Behind her, the scarred SEAL muttered, "She's reading the wind." The officer's lips parted, stunned. Even many trained shooters overlooked that detail, especially under pressure. Sarah inhaled again, deep and even. She held the breath, steadying herself, then exhaled half of it, freezing her body in a perfect balance between tension and release. In that instant, she was stone still. The desert, the crowd, the soldiers, they ceased to exist. There was only her, the rifle, and the target. The silence stretched. Every eye in the crowd was on her. Some leaned forward, so far they seemed about to fall from their seats. The SEALs stood frozen, their pride forgotten, their curiosity consuming them. The officer gripped the microphone tightly, but didn't dare speak. He could feel it too, the inevitability of something extraordinary about to happen. Sarah whispered, so faintly only she could hear it. "First one." Her finger rested gently on the trigger now, the pad pressing slowly, carefully. She didn't jerk, didn't rush. She applied pressure as though easing into a secret. And then crack. The rifle roared. The sound cut through the desert air like thunder. The first target dropped instantly, spinning backward with a loud metallic clang. The crowd gasped in unison. The silence shattered. Sarah didn't move, didn't celebrate. She adjusted slightly, her focus already shifting to the second target. But the ripple in the audience was undeniable. Gasps turned into murmurs. She hit it. Dead center. No way first try? The scarred SEAL's lips curled into something between disbelief and respect. He muttered under his breath, "That wasn't luck." Sarah exhaled again, her body steady as stone, the rifle already aligned with the next target. The officer stared at her, his heart pounding despite himself. He whispered to no one in particular, "Who is she?" The answer, he realized, would not come easily, because Sarah was only just beginning. The echo of Sarah's first shot lingered across the desert, fading into a stunned silence that seemed to swallow the entire range. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The fallen steel target at the far end was the only proof that it had actually happened. She had hit it. Dead center. The clang still reverberated faintly in the ears of the spectators when whispers began to ripple through the crowd. She hit it. First shot. Unbelievable. That was cleaner than any of the SEALs. But Sarah didn't acknowledge the whispers. She didn't lift her head or look toward the audience. She remained prone, her cheek pressed firmly against the stock, her eye steady behind the scope. Her focus had already shifted. The second target filled her vision now, sharp and waiting. She drew in another slow breath, steadying herself the same way she had for the first. She squeezed the trigger with the same measured control. Crack. The second target fell instantly, spinning back with a metallic thud. This time, the crowd didn't remain silent. Applause erupted, scattered at first, but quickly swelling into a roar. The SEAL with the scarred jaw folded his arms tighter across his chest. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in concentration. He had seen countless shooters, but very few with this kind of composure. She wasn't reacting to the cheers, wasn't distracted by the noise. Her breathing never changed. She was locked in. The officer in charge leaned toward him and muttered, "What's happening?" "Explain it." The SEAL shook his head slowly. "She's doing what we should have done. She's calm. She's disciplined. She's not letting the pressure touch her." The officer's frown deepened. "But she's a civilian." "Maybe not," the SEAL interrupted quietly. Crack! The third target dropped before they could continue. Now the audience was standing, clapping, cheering after each hit. Even the skeptical journalists who had been scribbling half-mocking notes earlier found themselves frozen, their pens hovering above their notepads, forgotten. Cameras clicked furiously, desperate to capture the unfolding story. But Sarah didn't hear the cheers. She was somewhere else entirely. Through the scope, the world was reduced to its essentials: target, wind, breath, trigger. The rhythm was familiar, almost meditative. She fired again. Another hit. Again. Another. By the 10th target, the applause was deafening. The officer muttered under his breath, "Impossible." The scarred SEAL shook his head again, his lips curling into a faint, reluctant smile. "Not impossible, just rare," Sarah continued. Each shot rang out like a drumbeat in a slow, unstoppable rhythm. The crowd no longer whispered, they roared. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders so they could see. Veterans saluted each hit with sharp nods of respect. Some of the SEALs, their pride stung but their admiration undeniable, clapped quietly behind her. And still, she did not falter. Her body moved in a precise cycle. Inhale, aim, adjust, exhale, fire. It was as though she had become the rifle itself. By the 20th hit, a reporter whispered into his recorder, his voice trembling, "This is history. We are watching something history will not forget." The officer beside him overheard and didn't argue. Sarah paused only briefly to adjust the scope for distance. Her hand was steady, her movements graceful, controlled. She was no longer proving herself, she was performing. The scarred SEAL crouched closer, studying her posture, her grip, her micro-adjustments. His eyes widened slightly. She wasn't just good. She was perfect. Every detail of her form spoke of long, disciplined training. Whoever she wasn't new to this. She was an expert. The officer crouched beside him, whispering, "She's embarrassing us. Do you understand what this looks like?" The SEAL glanced at him, unbothered. "Sir, this doesn't look like embarrassment. This looks like truth." The officer had no reply. Crack. The 30th target fell. The crowd's excitement built with every clang of steel. People were on their feet now, chanting her name even though most of them hadn't known it an hour ago. "Sarah, Sarah, Sarah." But Sarah didn't react. She was in a place beyond sound, beyond pressure. The chants, the applause, the cameras, it all melted away. Only the rifle and the targets existed. Her lips moved faintly as she whispered to herself, words no one else could hear. "Steady, center, breathe, crack." The 40th target clanged to the ground. By now, even the SEALs couldn't deny what they were seeing. A few of them exchanged looks of amazement, some shaking their heads, others chuckling in disbelief. One muttered, "She's showing us how it's done." The scarred SEAL didn't laugh. He only nodded once firmly. "She's the real deal." The officer's face was pale, his jaw clenched. "How far is she going to go?" The SEAL's reply was simple, almost reverent. "All the way." Sarah didn't know what they were saying. She didn't need to. The rifle cracked again, and the 50th target fell, dropping into the dust with a sound that seemed to echo in everyone's chest. Halfway, the crowd exploded into cheers. standing and clapping wildly. The energy was electric, unstoppable. What had begun as disbelief was now awe. Sarah remained calm, breathing slowly, already sighting the next target. Her hands were steady, her shoulders relaxed. To her, 50 wasn't the end. It was just the middle of the rhythm. The officer whispered to himself, almost in fear, "What if she doesn't miss?" The scarred seal, eyes still locked on Sarah, answered quietly, "Then we'll all remember this day for the rest of our lives." And with that, Sarah exhaled again, her finger pressing gently on the trigger, and the range braced itself for the next inevitable clang. The desert air shimmered as heat rose off the sand, but no one in the crowd noticed anymore. All eyes were fixed on Sarah, her body pressed firmly against the earth, her movements fluid and precise. 50 targets had already fallen, and the clang of each one still echoed in their minds like a drumbeat. She was halfway there, and not a single miss stained her record. The officer in charge wiped his forehead, though not from the heat. His nerves rattled inside him like loose metal. He had expected her to fail by the third or fourth shots, some lucky hits, followed by a mistake that would confirm what everyone already believed, that a civilian couldn't outshoot Navy SEALs. But Sarah hadn't faltered. She hadn't even hesitated. Each shot was flawless, mechanical in its perfection, yet strangely graceful, like watching an artist paint on the world's most dangerous canvas. The chants of "Sarah, Sarah," rolled like thunder across the bleachers. Parents clapped in rhythm with the sound of the rifle. Children bounced on their seats, their faces glowing with excitement. Veterans saluted each strike with nods of respect, whispering among themselves about the discipline they recognized in her. Sarah remained untouched by the noise. To her, there was no audience, no chanting, no roar of approval. There was only the rhythm. Inhale, aim, exhale, fire. She was locked inside her own silent world, where nothing mattered except the circle of glass in her scope and the targets beyond. Crack! The 51st target toppled. Applause erupted, and Sarah was already adjusting for the 52nd. The scarred SEAL crouched beside the officer again, his eyes never leaving her. "Watch her fingers," he said. "See how she resets her grip after every shot? That's not casual. That's training. The kind you don't forget." The officer scowled. Where would she have learned this? The SEAL didn't answer right away. His mind ran through possibilities: military, private training, years at the range, but none of them explained the poise. Shooting with precision was one thing. Doing it with this kind of calm, under this kind of pressure, was something else entirely. "She's not just trained," he said finally. "She's seasoned. Whoever taught her, they taught her well." Crack! The 52nd target fell. By now, Sarah's rhythm had become hypnotic. Each shot followed the same measured cadence, and the crowd responded as if rehearsed. Silence before the crack, then cheers as the steel fell. The desert had become a theater, and Sarah its lone performer. Somewhere in the bleachers, a journalist muttered to himself, "This isn't just a story. This is legend being born." The people around him nodded. They could feel it too. Sarah paused briefly after the 60th target, adjusting the scope again for the shifting wind. She wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, but didn't falter. Her focus was unshaken, her breathing steady. The scarred SEAL noticed. "She's managing fatigue," he whispered. "Even pros slip when the body tires. But she's pacing herself perfectly." The officer stared at him, incredulous. "Are you saying she could actually finish this? All 100? The SEAL's jaw tightened. "I'm saying she hasn't given me a reason to think otherwise." Crack! The 61st target dropped. The chants grew louder, rolling like a wave. The audience wasn't just entertained anymore, they were invested. Each clang of steel sent ripples of excitement through them. They wanted her to succeed. They wanted her to prove that the impossible could be done. Sarah's lips moved faintly as she whispered to herself between shots. Breathe, center, release. Her words were like a mantra, grounding her as the targets fell one after another. By the 75th shot, the noise from the stands was deafening. People were standing, clapping above their heads, their voices hoarse from cheering. Some had tears in their eyes, overwhelmed by the sheer audacity of what they were witnessing. And still, Sarah pressed forward. The officer felt his stomach twist. What had begun as a demonstration of SEAL dominance had turned into something else entirely. This wasn't their stage anymore. It was hers. Every fallen target was a reminder that the invincible SEALs had failed where a Koi, woman from the audience, was excelling beyond imagination. His pride screamed at him to call it off, to stop her before the humiliation grew, but even he knew it was too late. He muttered bitterly, "This story will spread like wildfire." The scarred SEAL gave a faint, humorless smile. "Good, let it. Crack." The 80th target collapsed. Sarah paused briefly, her finger resting gently near the trigger, her chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm. She adjusted for the last series of targets, which had been placed at extreme distances. These were the shots meant to test the SEALs, the ones where the wind, the heat, and the subtle curvature of the land could twist a bullet's path. She didn't hesitate. The crowd fell silent, sensing the shift in difficulty. The journalists leaned forward, cameras clicking in rapid succession. Veterans clenched their fists, whispering prayers under their breath. Crack! The 81st target fell. The silence broke like a dam bursting. Cheers thundered, louder than ever before. People shouted her name, stamped their feet, waved their arms in wild excitement. But Sarah remained composed. Her lips whispered the mantra again. Steady, center, release. The scarred SEAL felt something stir inside him, something rare, admiration, respect, awe. He had spent his life around warriors, but this was different. This was watching someone transcend limits, someone who belonged to no unit, no badge, no rank, yet outshined them all. By the 90th target, the audience was in a frenzy. Some clutched their heads in disbelief, others screamed themselves hoarse. Reporters shouted into phones, desperate to broadcast the unfolding miracle. And through it all, Sarah fired, each shot as calm and measured as the first. When the 95th target dropped, the officer buried his face in his hands. "She's going to do it," he whispered, his voice breaking. The scarred SEAL's eyes never left Sarah. "She already has," he replied. Sarah exhaled again, sighting the 96th target. The world around her melted into silence. The crowd, the desert, the Navy all faded. There was only her, the rifle, and the steel. Crack! The 96th target fell. Momentum wasn't just building anymore. It was unstoppable. Sarah was no longer proving herself. She was rewriting what everyone thought was possible. And as the 97th target dropped, the audience realized something that sent chills racing through their veins. She wasn't slowing down. She wasn't faltering. She was only growing stronger. The impossible was about to become reality. The sun had begun to sink lower in the sky, painting streaks of orange and gold across the desert horizon. Shadows stretched long and thin over the range, but no one noticed the changing light. The world had narrowed to the sound of one woman's rifle and the chorus of falling steel. 96 targets had already been claimed by Sarah's flawless precision. 96 echoes of CRACK still lived in the crowd's ears, each one etched deeper into memory than the last. Only 4 remained. 4 slim slivers of steel stood between her and the impossible. The audience sat or stood on the edge of eruption. Parents held their children tight, whispering, "Watch this. You'll never see anything like it again." Reporters leaned so far forward they nearly fell off their benches, their pens scratching furiously against their notepads. Veterans stood tall, their eyes glistening with something that hovered between respect and pride. The officer, however, looked pale. His jaw clenched so tightly it trembled. Each fallen target was another nail in the coffin of his demonstration. What was meant to be a showcase of SEAL supremacy had transformed into a stage for a woman no one had expected. And worse still, she hadn't missed. Not once. The scarred SEAL, crouched low near the firing line, studied Sarah without blinking. His expression, once skeptical, had softened into reverence. This wasn't about pride anymore. This wasn't about competition. This was about witnessing mastery so pure it transcended rank, badge, or unit. Sarah herself seemed untouched by the storm around her. Her body moved in the same measured rhythm it had since the first shot. Inhale, focus, exhale, squeeze. The rifle felt like an extension of her arm, the scope like her own vision. She was in complete harmony with the weapon, the desert, and herself. Crack! The 97th target spun back, clanging as it fell. The crowd erupted, but Sarah barely registered it. She was already shifting, aligning her sights for the 98th. Her mantra whispered in her mind again. Steady, center, release, C-R-A-C-K. The 98th target fell. Now the applause thundered so loud that the bleachers shook. People screamed her name, waved their arms, stomped their feet. The atmosphere was electric, as if the very air pulsed with belief. But for Sarah, there was still work to do. She inhaled slowly, realigning her sights for the 99th. A bead of sweat rolled down her temple, glinting in the setting sun. She didn't wipe it away. She didn't break her rhythm. The scarred SEAL leaned toward the officer, his voice low but sharp. Look at her. Look closely. 98 shots, and she hasn't broken once. Not her breath, not her focus. She's not just shooting, she's teaching us. The officer swallowed hard, unable to reply. Crack! The 99th target fell. And then silence. The kind of silence that presses against the chest, thick and suffocating. The crowd froze, their chants cut short. Even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath. Only one target remained. The 100th. It stood at the farthest edge of the range, barely visible without magnification. A sliver of steel against the golden horizon. It was the hardest target of them all, placed there deliberately, meant to humble even the finest marksman. This was the shot that had broken the SEALs earlier in the day. The wind shifted unpredictably out here. The heat warped the air into rippling mirages. The margin for error was microscopic. Sarah adjusted her scope, her movements unhurried. She inhaled deeply, letting the air fill her lungs, then exhaled slowly, steadying her heartbeat. Through the scope, the final target gleamed faintly, waiting. The officer whispered hoarsely, "She can't hit that." "No one can." The scarred SEAL didn't look at him. "Watch." The crowd seemed frozen in time. Not a sound carried through the air. No chants, no applause, no whispers. All eyes locked on Sarah, their collective breath held. Her fingers settled gently against the trigger. Her lips moved faintly, whispering her mantra one last time. Steady, center, release. For a fraction of a second, the world seemed to vanish. And then CRACK. The rifle's report cracked like thunder, the sound ricocheting across the range. For an instant, no one dared to look. The bullet tore through the desert air, fighting wind and distance, slicing through heat distortions. Time slowed to a crawl. And then clang. The 100th target toppled backward, spinning as it fell into the dust. For a heartbeat, the world was silent. The audience stared, stunned, their minds refusing to process what their eyes had just seen. Even Sarah stayed still, her cheek pressed to the stock, her breathing steady, as though she were confirming for herself that it was real. And then the silence shattered. The crowd exploded with a roar so loud it seemed to shake the desert itself. People leapt to their feet, screaming, clapping, hugging strangers, waving their arms in disbelief. Children shrieked with joy. Veterans saluted with trembling hands. Reporters screamed into their recorders, their words nearly drowned out by the pandemonium. 100! Someone shouted, and the chant erupted instantly. 100! 100! 100! Sarah finally lifted her head from the rifle, blinking as if returning from another world. She looked downrange at the fallen steel, the final piece of her impossible streak, and allowed herself a small, quiet smile. The scarred seal rose to his feet and clapped, slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving her. His applause spread quickly through the group of seals, some hesitant at first, others grinning in disbelief, until they all joined in, saluting her not with words, but with respect. The officer, however, sat frozen, his face drained of color. He muttered to himself, "Impossible. It's impossible." But no one heard him over the roar of the crowd. Sarah stood, brushing the dust from her clothes. She didn't raise her arms in triumph. She didn't bow. She simply glanced at the fallen targets, then at the cheering crowd, and whispered the same words she had spoken at the beginning. "Let me try." The simplicity of it struck harder than any boast could have. She hadn't come to humiliate, hadn't come to prove herself against anyone. She had simply asked for a chance, and with it, she had done what no one else could. The chants grew louder, echoing across the desert and into history. 100! 100! 100! And Sarah, calm as ever, set the rifle down gently, her expression serene. For her, it wasn't about glory. It was about focus, discipline, and belief. For everyone else, it was about witnessing the impossible made real. The desert was still echoing with the chant, 100! 100! 100! It rolled across the bleachers like thunder, growing louder each time it was shouted, until it felt less like a chant and more like a force of nature. People stomped their feet, clapped their hands, and raised their voices to the sky as if trying to etch Sarah's achievement into history itself. Sarah, however, remained calm in the middle of the storm. She set the rifle down gently, almost reverently, as though it were not a weapon, but a trusted partner that had carried her through the impossible. She didn't lift her arms in triumph, didn't soak in the adulation. She only straightened, brushed the dust from her knees, and let her eyes linger on the distant line of fallen targets. 100 pieces of steel lay scattered like silent witnesses to what she had just done. Reporters rushed forward first, breaking the invisible barrier of shock. Cameras flashed in a frenzy, shutters clicking as dozens of lenses fought to capture the moment. Microphones appeared like spears pointing toward her, voices overlapping in a chaotic storm. "Who are you? Where did you learn to shoot like that? Was this luck or skill? Do you realize you just made history?" Sarah blinked at the sudden wave of questions, but didn't flinch. She didn't push them away or lean toward the microphones. She simply answered softly, her voice calm, almost disarmingly modest. "I just wanted to try." The simplicity of the response stunned the crowd into silence for half a heartbeat before the roar rose again, louder than before. Her words spread like wildfire, repeated by every journalist, every spectator, every ear that caught them. "I just wanted to try." The scarred seal, still standing near the firing line, crossed his arms and smiled faintly. "That's it," he muttered. "That's her secret." The officer turned to him, his face pale and sour. Her secret? She wasn't chasing glory, the SEAL replied. She wasn't afraid of failure. She just wanted the chance. That's what freed her. That's why she didn't miss. The officer clenched his jaw, but he couldn't argue. The truth was undeniable. Several of the SEALs approached Sarah now, their boots crunching in the dirt. They didn't look angry. They didn't look resentful. Instead, they looked humbled. One by one, they stopped in front of her, nodding in respect. The scarred SEAL stepped forward first, extending his hand. "You've earned something we don't give lightly," he said. "Respect." Sarah looked at him, then down at his hand, and shook it firmly. She didn't smile boastfully. She only nodded, acknowledging his words. "Thank you," she said simply. Another SEAL stepped forward. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" he asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. Sarah glanced past him at the horizon, her eyes distant. "Life teaches you strange things," she said, offering no details. And somehow, the mystery only deepened her legend. The officer, meanwhile, struggled in silence. His plan, his carefully crafted demonstration, had collapsed in front of him. His men, his elite SEALs, had been outshined by a civilian. Worse, the world had seen it. He could feel the weight of cameras capturing every twitch of his jaw, every flicker of anger in his eyes. His pride screamed at him to take control, to reclaim the stage, but he knew it was useless. The story was no longer his to shape. The audience, still chanting, began to spill down from the bleachers. Families rushed toward Sarah, children tugging at their parents' hands to get closer. A little girl with braided hair pushed forward, clutching a small notebook. "Miss Sarah," she said timidly, her voice barely audible over the cheers. "Can I have your autograph?" Sarah crouched down to meet her eyes. She smiled gently and signed the notebook without hesitation, handing it back with a wink. "Remember," she whispered, "never be afraid to try." The girl's eyes widened with awe. She clutched the notebook to her chest and ran back to her parents, shouting, "She talked to me. She talked to me." Moments like that began to multiply. A veteran in a wheelchair saluted her, tears streaking his weathered face. Sarah saluted back, her movement crisp and respectful. Another young man shouted, "You showed us what's possible." Others echoed him, their voices blending into the still booming chant. The scarred SEAL turned back to the officer. "You see it now, don't you? This isn't about humiliation. It's about inspiration. Every single person here is walking away changed. You couldn't buy this kind of lesson." The officer shook his head, muttering under his breath, "You don't understand. This wasn't supposed to happen." "No," the SEAL said firmly. "This was exactly what was supposed to happen." Sarah finally raised a hand, not for attention, but simply as a gentle gesture to the crowd. The chant slowed, then softened, the roar fading into a respectful hush. She looked around, her gaze sweeping across the sea of faces, strangers, soldiers, reporters, children. "I didn't come here to prove anything," she said, her voice carrying easily in the stillness. "I just asked for a chance. That's all any of us need sometimes, just a chance." Her words landed like thunder wrapped in silk. People nodded, some wiping their eyes, others clapping softly in agreement. The scarred SEAL whispered to himself, almost reverently, "She's right." The officer lowered his gaze, unable to meet hers. He knew history wouldn't remember his face or his words. It would remember hers. The reporters scribbled furiously, their headlines already writing themselves. "Civilian outscores SEALs in unbelievable feat. Let me try." The words that made history: one woman, one rifle, 100 hits, as the sun dipped further behind the horizon, painting the desert in dusky red and gold. Sarah turned once more to the fallen targets. A faint breeze carried dust across the range, swirling around the silent steel. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders finally relaxing. She had done it. Not for fame, not for applause, not even for pride. Simply because she had been given the chance. And as the crowd swarmed around her, as chants of 100 rolled through the desert night, Sarah remained the calmest person there. For in her heart, she knew the truth. Greatness isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself right when no one else believes you can. By the time the crowd had dispersed from the desert range, word of what had just occurred was already taking flight. Smartphones had captured every moment, live streams had gone viral, and reporters were scrambling to file stories that would reach millions before the sun even set. News helicopters hovered over the range, capturing the scattered steel targets and the single woman who had changed the course of a demonstration forever. The officer, once a commanding presence, had receded into the background. His earlier authority now seemed fragile, his plans overshadowed by the undeniable reality of what had taken place. He muttered to himself, pacing the edge of the firing line. How did she do it? The scarred SEAL, standing beside him, watched Sarah as she gathered her things, her movements calm and deliberate. Because she had the courage to try, he said simply. Not everyone gets that. Across the nation, news outlets began broadcasting clips of her flawless shots. Headlines exploded in bold type. Civilian outsmarts SEALs, hits 100 targets straight, let me try, becomes a national rallying cry. A woman, a rifle, and the impossible achieved. Social media erupted. Hashtags trended worldwide. Hashtag let me try, hashtag 100 hits, hashtag Sarah, the sharpshooter. Comments flooded in from people inspired by her story, young and old alike, recounting moments in their lives when they had hesitated to try and promising themselves that they would no longer wait. At the range, journalists pressed Sarah with questions. They wanted names, backgrounds, training history, anything that could explain the miracle they had just witnessed. But Sarah remained composed, answering simply and consistently. I just wanted to try, she repeated. Everyone deserves a chance to try. Her words struck a chord far deeper than her skill with a rifle. They resonated with anyone who had faced doubt, anyone who had been told they were incapable, anyone who had been afraid to step forward. Her story became more than a demonstration. It became a symbol of courage and perseverance. The SEALs, who had once stood proudly as experts, now looked at her not as a competitor, but as a teacher. They invited her to their command tent, asking questions, studying her posture, her breathing, her approach. Even the officer, humbled and quiet, couldn't deny the depth of her talent. You've set a new standard, one SEAL said, his voice filled with awe. Not just for us, but for everyone watching today, Sarah nodded humbly. I'm just proof that anyone can try. Schools across the country began referencing her story in classrooms, teaching students about discipline, focus, and courage. Youth programs incorporated her mantra, let me try, as a motto to inspire children to face challenges boldly. The day after the demonstration, the video clips had already reached millions. Media outlets interviewed witnesses, children, parents, veterans, and journalists. Every account told the same story. Sarah had done the impossible, and she had done it with humility, grace, and unwavering focus. One veteran remarked, I've trained with some of the finest marksmen in the world, but I've never seen anything like her. She didn't just hit the targets, she taught us all a lesson about courage. Meanwhile, Sarah returned home quietly, her fame growing with each passing hour. She didn't seek attention. She didn't solicit interviews. Yet journalists arrived at her doorstep, eager to capture her perspective. I didn't do this for recognition, she told a reporter. I did it because I wanted a chance. Anyone who's willing to try can achieve far more than they believe. Her words resonated nationally. Late-night talk shows covered her story. Newspapers printed profiles, recounting her calm demeanor, her focus, and the perfect 100 targets she had hit. Sports and military analysts dissected her technique, marveling at her precision. Everyone agreed on one thing. Sarah had become more than a sharpshooter. She had become a symbol, a reminder that courage, focus, and perseverance could defy expectations. Even the SEALs incorporated her philosophy into their training programs. While their technical skills were unparalleled, Sarah had shown them a critical lesson. The mind's steadiness often determined the outcome more than any muscle memory or military protocol. Months later, Sarah was invited to speak at events across the country. From schools to military academies, audiences hung on her every word. And everywhere she went, she shared the same simple message. Don't wait for permission. Don't wait for someone else to believe in you. Just try. That's how change happens. That's how the impossible becomes possible. The officer, still a fixture in military circles, watched from a distance as Sarah's legend grew. At first, his pride bristled at the thought of being overshadowed by a civilian. But over time, he came to recognize the power of her example. He realized that the story wasn't about humiliation. It was about inspiration. It was about showing the world that greatness could emerge from the most unexpected places, and that courage could eclipse experience. For Sarah, life returned to a quieter rhythm. Yet her story continued to ripple outward. She received letters from children, veterans, and civilians who had been motivated by her words. They shared their own stories of courage, of moments when they decided to try despite fear. Each letter, each message, was a reminder that her single act had sparked countless others. And still, she remained humble. She did not see herself as a hero, nor did she seek fame. She had simply asked for a chance, and she had embraced it fully. That was all. The world, however, would not forget. Museums displayed photographs from the range. Documentaries chronicled her feat. Her name became synonymous with courage and determination. And in classrooms, playgrounds, and living rooms, children repeated her words, emboldened to face their own challenges. "Let me try," they said. And through them, Sarah's legacy continued. Years later, even the SEALs spoke of that day as if it were mythic. New recruits learned about the civilian who had outshot the best, the woman who had hit 100 targets straight, while the most skilled professionals had faltered. Her story was told not as a tale of competition, but as a lesson in perseverance, focus, and the quiet strength of courage. In the end, Sarah never sought recognition. She never demanded applause. She simply tried. And in trying, she changed the world one target, one person, and one courageous act at a time. The desert where it all began remained silent, the fallen targets slowly rusting under the sun. But the story of Sarah's 100 hits echoed far beyond the sand, in hearts, in minds, and across generations. A single act of courage had created a legacy that would inspire countless others to do the same, to rise, to focus, and above all, to try.